Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I am Ben Anderson.
I'm Chandler Holt.
We are recording this on May 21st. We are a little more than a month away from the NBA draft. And actually, one of the weird things is as soon as the finals ends now, which we don't know how quickly that's going to happen, you're going to have teams that can agree to deals with their players, with their star players. So actually, we're going to get the free agency news probably within the next month, actually. You don't have to wait until July 1st anymore or even June 30th, which they moved it up for 6 hours for whatever reason. But you're going to have to start hearing extension news. So guys like Jimmy Butler, Donovan Mitchell, actually there's going to be some interesting pieces of news in the next month. But a lot of people I know are focused on the draft right now. We'll touch on that a little bit, but not a ton. I do think we will, as we lead up to the draft a little bit and kind of put the 2023-2024 season behind us, Chandler, we will start to focus a little bit more on that, but I think we're still putting the final touches on this season. And today we are going to talk about 3 players that were traded by the Jazz, kind of revisit those trades just a little bit. Of course, talk the Jazz news, and then wrap up the show with the mailbag. Every Tuesday I send out a question on Twitter asking for your questions about the Utah Jazz, the NBA, whatever you want to talk about. And we address those to end the segment. You can find us on Twitter at Ben's Hoops, at Chandler Holt KSL, and of course read us at kslsports.com. All right, Chandler, where are we starting?
Let's start with the weekly news. First up, Jazz rookie Keontae George was announced. He made the all-rookie second team. On the first team, it was Victor Wembanyama, Chet Holmgren, Brandon Miller, Jaime Jaquez, and Brandon Podziemski.
Yep.
Okay. And then second team, Derek Lively, Gigi Jackson, Keontae, Amen Thompson, and Cason Wallace.
What do you think of all rookie teams?
Honestly, I think that they're good. Seeing that Keontae George was one of, 2, 3? Actually, no, the second team has a lot of guards. But Scoot Henderson isn't on there. A lot of people thought that he was going to be on there, but then had sort of a slow start to the season, picked it up later, but wasn't enough to make a team. But the top 3, Victor, Chet, Brandon Miller, all make sense. They should be on that first team. I have no problems with it.
It's kind of interesting to see Scoot averaged more points than Keontae George. He averaged more rebounds than Keontae George. He averaged more assists than Keontae George. He didn't shoot as well, but it wasn't much different. I mean, Keontae George shot 39% from the floor and 38% from and Scoot shot 38%. So there's a 1% difference between how they shot from the floor. And same goes for the three-point line. Keontae George was 33%. Scoot was 32%. There wasn't a lot of difference in these players, which in some sense, we're talking about Scoot being the biggest bust ever. And so, why are people all that excited about Keontae George if he's 1 percentage point from both the floor and 3 away from being Scoot Henderson? But at the same time, it's one of these guys was drafted 3rd overall and needed to be the face of the franchise, and one of these guys was the second player they took in the first round for the Jazz, who was kind of an upside swing, and I guess you hope pans out, Now, one of the things also is that Scoot played a lot more minutes per game than Keontae George did, because Keontae actually played more minutes but appeared in 13 more games this year than Scoot did. Scoot didn't play a whole lot of games. Scoot averaged 28.5 minutes per game. Keontae averaged in his appearances 27. So it's only a minute and a half. It's not crazy. But they had very similar rookie seasons, and Keontae does get the nod over Scoot, which I think tells you a lot about expectation and then how we reward expectation when it comes to this type of all-rookie team.
I would be interested to look into some advanced stats like usage rate, because I feel like we talked a lot about Keontae having a lot of opportunity later in the year, and Scoot probably had that from day one with the Portland Trailblazers being the higher pick.
I've got it pulled up on Basketball Reference. Scoot had a 26.5% usage rate. I mean, about a quarter of his team's possessions when he was on the floor, which is very high. Keontae's was at 22.8.
Okay.
So not as high, certainly. Yeah. Not great, not bad. Keontae's numbers, though, really across the board were just better. And I do think some of the issues, even though, again, I remember writing Keontae's kind of pre-draft analysis, which I've started again. You can find him at kslsports.com. And one of the things I wrote is he's billed as a shooter who doesn't shoot, which is true. He was billed as this guy who really knocked down shots. Well, he shot 37% from the floor in college and 33% from 3, which is a little worse than he's doing now, but it's basically the same player.
Yeah.
Now, the nice thing is that has expanded to the NBA, where the three-point line is deeper and he's continued to hit them at the same rate. That actually encourages me a little bit that maybe he will be able to figure it out. We will see if he can finish inside the paint a little bit better. He got better at it throughout the season, I thought, but again, his legs gave out a little bit. I think ultimately what I'm pulling out of Keontae George, making the all-rookie second team is you'd rather make it than not make it, and the jury's still out.
Yep.
The same way the jury is definitely still out on Scoot Henderson. I mean, I will tell you personally, I am not on the Scoot Henderson's a bust train. We don't know. It's really early. It was a bad situation in Portland. They've got 10 guards that are all lottery picks, and he's just a weird fit. They would have been far better off landing Brandon Miller, which I was wrong. I mean, I thought I would have taken Scoot over Brandon Miller last year in the draft, and clearly Brandon Miller has turned into a better player already and has much higher upside with his size and athleticism, et cetera. So I'm not out on Scoot entirely, nor would I ever be out on Keontae George after one season. And again, I think good to make an all-rookie team versus not make it, but there's a lot of work yet to be done. I will say this. I know there's a lot of Jazz fans who are curious about, like, does this team have any young pieces that are any good? You've got back-to-back all-rookie team members. Walker Kessler made the all-rookie first team 2 years ago. Keontae made it this year. Now, maybe this is a sign that all-rookie teams don't matter all that much because Walker had a great first year and a pretty bad second year. But maybe also you just need to give these guys a couple of seasons, and you saw interesting flashes enough in the first season that there's a lot of work there to be done.
Next piece of news. A report came out last week from Kristen Peak and Yahoo Sports that the Jazz were interested in working out and drafting Bronny, potentially with the 32nd overall pick in the draft. Now, from my perspective, I don't think that this is because they think Bronny is worth the 32nd pick, and I don't think it's because they're trying to lure LeBron to Salt Lake City. I think, if anything, it's to bait the Lakers into a trade. Do you think there's anything behind this rumor, and do you think that would be why?
I guarantee you the Jazz will work him out. I mean, the Jazz are going to work out 100 players.
Yes.
So, of course, Bronny James is in that conversation. He's in the draft.
Yep.
They're going to work out everybody who will come to Utah. And again, one of the things to remember about this is you work out guys not just to draft them, but to know them. You know, the Jazz worked out Jordan Clarkson. They didn't draft him, but 5 years later when he was on the trade market and they had to trade Dante Exum, they said, let's go revisit. I mean, I've been told this. They revisited their interviews because they record all of them. They listened to what Jordan said. They were comfortable with who he was as a person, and they brought him in. So they will do the same thing with Bronny. If 3 years from now Bronny's a G League player and they say, hey, I don't remember this about him, or we haven't talked to him recently. What did he say when we asked him this question 3 years ago? Oh, that was a good answer. Or, oh, I remember liking that. Or he said this is who he was going to be, and now this is the player he is. Like, those things all matter. So some of that intel, I think, is really important. So, yes, the Jazz will absolutely work out Bronny James. And by the way, just because they work him out doesn't mean he's an NBA player.
Yep.
The number of non-NBA players the Jazz have worked out, like, it's really funny. I can go back because they used to do open draft workouts. You could go and talk to the players after. They don't do that anymore. They don't announce it. But you would get, like, crazy players who are really good NBA players now that have worked out in Utah. And, like, the guys that were working out, you've never heard of. You know, it was like, yeah, he was the backup center at Providence, and he went up against Julius Randle when Julius Randle was here in Salt Lake City. And I don't know what happened to the guy from Providence or whatever. I don't know.
Yeah.
He never turned into anybody, but it is really funny to go back and look at some of these lists of, oh, that guy was a draft prospect at one point. He's not even close. He never even sniffed the NBA. So I'm not reading too much into it. I absolutely believe that the Jazz are going to work him out. Are they at the point where they're seriously considering drafting somebody at 32? No. Do I believe Kristen Peak heard that? 100%. Do I think she heard it from somebody in the know? 100%, because I know how good Kristen is at her job. Do I think the Jazz are being underhanded in that because it's the second pick of the second round and there's going to be an entire night off in between the first round and the second round, and they're going to try and juice up the value of that pick as much as possible? So if the Lakers have to trade the 55th pick and a future second or 2 future seconds to move up to 32 to draft LeBron James' son, great. You're doing your job. You're supposed to poison the well. And that's what you're doing. You know, unfortunately, that is the gamesmanship of the draft. I had another front office member from the Jazz say, remember, it's lying season. I mean, that's what the draft is. It's lying season, and that's what's going on right now for the Jazz.
One more thing before we get into our player highlights. The all defensive teams just came out. On the first team, it's kind of funny to see without the positional locks anymore. We have 4 centers on the first team. Rudy Gobert, of course, Defensive Player of the Year. Victor Wembanyama, Bam Adebayo, Anthony Davis, and Herb Jones. And then on the second team, mostly guards, we have Alex Caruso, Drew Holiday, Jaden McDaniels, Jalen Suggs, and Derek White.
I think this is right.
I think this is perfect.
I don't actually like getting rid of the positions because I think you can't ask Alex Caruso to play center.
Yes.
So he's still very valuable as a guard. But the truth is, a good defensive center is more valuable than a good defensive guard.
Yes.
It just is. They're near the rim. They're going to challenge way more shots, et cetera, et cetera. Why I think this is interesting is, again, it's this value that Walker Kessler actually does have. If he can figure it out, like I know everybody was down on him this year. He was down on himself, all of these issues. If he can get it right, he's so valuable. Because, I mean, I just retweeted yesterday from Basketball Index, which is a good Twitter follow if you don't, _B_ball_index, the top 10 second-year players in defensive LeBron. It's just a catch-all stat. Number one player is Walker Kessler. He's the best defensive player from that class. Go back every year, the best defensive player from their class is an elite defensive player. Like, you get the best guy out of a certain class, they're going to make a major impact. And where the Jazz are the worst right now is defensively. They are awful. If you can get Walker Kessler on the floor, having a positive impact, and find a way to use him with the team, he has a lot of value and might be a guy that 3 or 4 years down the line, you're like, yeah, you built a defense around him. He's that good, and it's really valuable to have him. So centers matter, is my short way of saying what I just explained for too long. And if you can get the most out of Walker Kessler, he could be a type of guy who has an impact like we're seeing on this list. Now, there's a real star value of those top 5 players outside of Herb Jones, but they're impactful in part because they're so good defensively.
Something kind of funny, looking at the 4 centers on first team, honestly, I would say the least versatile defender of them is Rudy Gobert, Defensive Player of the Year.
Yeah.
Like Victor, just mostly because of his length, he's not a great perimeter defender. Bam Adebayo and AD can all step out of the paint and make some stuff happen. But with this new format, I think that all defensive first team, if Walker can figure it out, is definitely achievable.
And is accurate because you start, where it's good to get rid of the positions is, Bam is actually one of the best defenders in the world. And if you consider him a center and he can't win it because Rudy Gobert or in the past, Brook Lopez was there, it's like, well, okay, you're going to say, well, Bam wasn't actually that good. No, Bam was that good.
Yes.
But he's getting shorted just because of a lack of position opportunities in the all-defensive team when Bam is an elite defensive player. So I like the list. I think they got the list right. And again, good to look at the guards who are valuable, and those guys are difference makers as well, and those are the types of players you've got to start looking at if you're the Utah Jazz to maybe not get those specific players, but mimic those types of players and the types of impacts they can have. Not all of those guys were on winning teams, but for the most part, they make a big impact. All right, let's take a quick break. We will come back. We will look back at the players the Jazz traded, and we will jump into the mailbag. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. All right, Chandler, we've been going through every player on the Jazz roster, kind of reviewing how they played, highest moments, worst moments, and overall outlook. We're switching it up a little bit because we're doing 3 players who are no longer on the Jazz. We're just kind of revisiting the 2 trades the Jazz made at the deadline. That is, of course, Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji being traded to the Toronto Raptors, and then Simone Fontecchio getting traded to the Detroit Pistons.
Yes, we started off by looking at the best vets. Then we moved on to the rookies. Last year we did our first group of 4 with the other vets. Going back to 3 with those 3, like you mentioned. Who do you want to start with?
Let's go with the one-off trade instead of trying to do 2 players in one in Toronto. And let's go with Simone Fontecchio. 10.5 points, 3.7 rebounds with the Jazz, 1.5 assists.
Yes, and honestly, Kelly Olynyk and Simone both had better, started playing better when they went to their new team, but I would say Simone had the biggest improvement. Played 50 games with the Jazz, averaged 8.9 points, 3.5 rebounds on about 45, 39, 80 shooting splits, and then in 16 games with the Pistons, not a very big sample size, he jumped up to 15.4 points, 4.4 rebounds, and also his shooting went way up, even with more opportunity, more shots getting up, 48% from the floor, over 42% from 3, and 85% from the line.
He had a great close to the year.
Yes.
A really great close to the year, as you mentioned. Good for Simone. Played 7 more minutes a game. Was not a full-time starter, and in fact, they did some weird stuff to try and not get him a starter because it changes how he can get paid, et cetera. But I think he ended up hitting the requirements anyways. He's going to get a lot of money this summer.
Yep.
Is the truth. And I think Detroit's going to be able to pay him, but don't be surprised if Philly swings in and is like, hey, we're going to lose Kelly Oubre, or we don't want Kelly Oubre, but we kind of want some of the things he did, and we want a more efficient shooter, and we've got all this money. But Orlando needs another scorer. Like, there's so many teams who actually can sell themselves on the idea of a very reliable 28-year-old in his prime with, I don't want to say he has a scorching high basketball IQ, but he's played a ton of basketball in his life because he's 28 and he's probably been a pro since he was 17 years old, that you can trust him in big situations. He's just going to get a lot of money. He's going to get at least the full mid-level exception, and some team honestly may come out and offer him $15, $16, $17, $18 million, and that wouldn't surprise me at all.
And I don't know how much of this can actually be attributed to Kelly and Simone leaving town, but the Jazz were like a noticeably worse shooting and defending team when those two left.
Oh, that completely changed.
Yeah.
Completely changed the roster.
And I think that Simone had a lot to do with that. Like, he isn't by any means like a lockdown defender or a defensive playmaker, but I think that he just tries on that end.
He knows how to play.
Yeah, exactly. He has that defensive IQ. And honestly, I think that before this year, we were talking about how we don't even know if Simone was going to be an NBA player.
Yeah, that was a big question going into the season. Is he an NBA player?
And then he came in and proved exactly that. He was a huge part of the Jazz's run, specifically in December and January when they were winning games. So yeah, breakout season for him. He struggled a little bit earlier in the year, but he proved that he can have a big impact.
And then the question is, again, I guess I'll ask this question at the end of it, is it a mistake? Is it a mistake that you traded these guys at this point? So Simone, good season with the Jazz, is actually exactly what they wanted.
Yes.
They signed a guy for basically nothing out of Italy 2 years ago, and they turned him into a relatively valuable asset, the 32nd overall pick in the draft. And Gabriel Procida, who we talked about, was just named the rising star in the EuroLeague. Like, that's a hit. Actually, you really hit on that free agent signing. You got another future asset. We'll see what it turns into. Maybe it's Bronny James or whatever. And another young player that is in the coffer that ideally you can bring in and have be a role player in 2 years or 3 years or maybe better because he's only 21 years old. In all honesty, the signing was a hit.
Yes.
I know some Jazz fans were frustrated that they were 26 and 26 and in the running for a play-in tournament spot. Honestly, if they kept him, I don't think they still get there with how well the teams that did make the play-in tournament finished. But was a good player that the Jazz traded away for a blind asset at best right now, not like a guaranteed good young player or a guaranteed good draft pick, but at least something to keep that asset alive for a guy that they weren't going to be interested in competing to sign this offseason because he's going to make so much money.
Yeah, so I think that you want to do them after each player when we finish.
Yeah, we can go ahead. We can do it after every player.
I think that, honestly, even though he was a big part of the Jazz's roster before he was traded, I think that it was probably the right decision to trade him, right? The Jazz were clearly going in that direction. Like you said, possibly wouldn't have even made it if they stuck with it. And I think that you don't want to be paying him 15, 18 million, whatever it is.
I agree.
Yeah.
You weren't going to pay him 15 or 18 million, and you didn't want to lose an asset for nothing.
Yep.
That's the smart job. It's not fun. But you got value out of nothing. You turned a nothing free agent signing into something.
Yes.
And if you can do that over and over, you're going to become a rich person because you're collecting interest on your investments. And that's what the Jazz did. All right, let's look at the Kelly Olynyk and Ochai Agbaji trade. They sent them to the Toronto Raptors. They got Kyra Lewis Jr. back. We will talk about Kyra in another podcast more. But also, they got Otto Porter Jr., who was bought out, waived, and a late first-round pick.
Yes.
Value-wise, a lottery pick from a year ago in Ochai Agbaji. Now, it wasn't the Jazz's pick, but it was a lottery pick by the Cleveland Cavaliers. 1 year later, for a late first-round pick, is a bad value.
Yep.
You lost basically 15 spots in the draft in 1 year. And Kelly Olynyk for almost nothing, I guess, in that case, right? Like, you lost Kelly for nothing. If you were to just go the 14th pick for the 29th pick the next season, that's a bad trade. And then you throw in Kelly Olynyk, who's a very valuable player who can help teams, that's a bad trade. But you add the context of who is Ochai Agbaji, and then what were the Jazz going to do with Kelly Olynyk this offseason, and again, it continues to paint the picture a little differently.
Yeah, I think that the biggest difference between the Kelly and Simone trade, I'm gonna jump ahead here talking about if the Jazz should have traded him or not. Kelly has shown that he can contribute to winning basketball, right? He's been on good teams in the past. Simone just been on the Jazz, who haven't been good the past 2 years, and then went to the Pistons, who were the worst team in the league.
Yeah.
And he had a little bit of a jump
Got
there.
a bunch of opportunity.
Yeah, exactly. But I think Kelly, say the Jazz could figure out a deal to keep him around, even though he's on the back half of his career, I still think in 3-4 years he could be a really good, solid rotation player off the bench, even on a contending team. But let's get into his stats. He averaged 9.8 points, 5.3 rebounds, 4.4 assists, played 50 games with the Jazz, and then 28 with the Raptors. He jumped up about 4 points per game with the Raptors, up about half a rebound, up an assist, and then the one thing that changes, his shooting did drop off a little bit. He went from 43% from three with the Jazz down to 34%.
And let me add a little bit of context I forgot in this trade. The other thing the Jazz got out of this was they guaranteed themselves a top 10 pick.
Yes.
Now, they dropped from 8 to 10, but they got a top 10 pick, which there was a real chance they were going to lose the 12th pick. If you have Kelly Olynyk, you were going to win too many games.
True.
Same goes for Simone. I don't know if it applies to Ochai, but Simone and Kelly, you don't trade those guys. You end up with the 12th pick that conveys to OKC, and then you don't know what you have next year. But also, you probably lose those guys for nothing, and you lose your first-round pick, and then you're going into next season wondering, like, did you just lose a top 10 pick for nothing? When you might have another top 10 pick next year. Easily, the Jazz could have another top 10 pick next year that doesn't convey to Oklahoma City. So that's another piece of context. It's really important in this conversation of you didn't just lose these guys for nothing. I think realistically, the Jazz could have re-signed Kelly Olynyk this offseason. I kind of said that the whole season. Yeah. This doesn't have to be a dying asset if you don't want it to be. I think he was happy here. I think he would have gladly stayed if the Jazz had made him the right competitive offer. Again, there are going to be teams with money out there that just need to improve their roster. And as we talked about, I think last show, it's not a great free agent class. Kelly Olynyk and Simone Fontecchio were probably realistically top 5 or 6 players in the free agent class. Now, if Paul George hits the market, that changes. We don't know if he's going to. But D'Angelo Russell, Kyle Anderson, who I mentioned, is not a bad option. These guys are in their late 20s. I mean, Kelly's much older than that. Kelly's 32, going to be 33 by the time I think the season starts next year. No, he just turned 33.
Okay.
So he's not at the end of his career. I mean, he's a big guy who doesn't rely on his athleticism all that much. He probably has 5 or 6 years of good basketball left. It just doesn't fit what the Jazz are trying to do. And it really didn't. And that's why they pulled the plug on him. And I was told that they just didn't feel like his age matched up with where the Jazz feel like they are with the 26-year-old Lauri Markkanen. And so they were happy to move on from him and get some value out of it.
Yeah, and I think that Kelly Olynyk just fits so well with what the Jazz had in the front court, specifically with John Collins and Walker Kessler. He can stretch the floor a little bit, and he's also one of the better big man playmakers in the league. So I think it might sound crazy to be like, oh, the Jazz would have been too good with Olynyk, but that's just the true, and it's more of a fit thing than an actual skill thing.
Yes, it's not that Kelly's impossible to replace.
Yes.
He just was such a good fit here for what the Jazz lacked, which is you need to have a floor spacer as a big who can pass next to John Collins and next to Lowry, because neither of those guys are good passers. He checked a lot of boxes. And again, this offseason, the Jazz could have said, oh, we want to give you $15 million. And I just don't know if Philly's going to come in with some sweetheart deal and saying, hey, you know what? Joel plays 60 games a year, and Kelly Olynyk is a really good backup center who can start, actually. And even if you want to start him next to Joel, he can play. You can absolutely start Kelly and Joel on the same team. And if they don't end up with Paul George, and they still have $85 million this summer to spend, Kelly Olynyk shoots up their board.
Yep.
And it's not just, oh, well, they've got to give him a 4-year, $80 million deal. Maybe they give him a Bruce Brown 2-year, $40 million deal with the first year guaranteed and the second year fully non-guaranteed team option. And Kelly says, yeah, I mean, it's $20 million. I'm not making that. I mean, the Jazz are offering me a 2-year, $24 million, and I can sign 1 year, 20, and maybe either hit free agency again next year or get the second year guaranteed if I'm great. That deal is going to come for some of these players that I don't know if the Jazz had any interest in paying. And because that unpredictability is why they included him.
All right, we can quickly go over Ochai Agbaji. He played 51 games for the Jazz, 27 for the Raptors. Season stats about 5.8 points, 2.8 rebounds, 1.1 assists. He had a little bit better stats with the Raptors, but again, had his shooting drop a little bit. 42.6 and 33 when he was with the Jazz, down to 39 and a 21.7% from 3 with the Raptors.
The problem with Ochai, again, wasn't the averages changing in Toronto. It's if you go and look through his game logs, it continues to be this, not even feast or famine, but just the number of games where he does nothing is a lot for me to overcome. More so than just oh, he was uncomfortable and he didn't figure out his shooting percentages. You remember Mike Conley moves to Utah and his shooting percentages were horrible until he figured it out. It just took a little while.
Yep.
You still have games for Ochai where he plays 26 minutes and scores 0 points. He did that against Detroit on March 13th. Late in the season, he is coming back from an injury, but he's playing against Milwaukee. He plays 35 minutes. He has 3 points. It's just he has 2 games later against Indiana. He plays 28 minutes. He has 2 points.
Yeah.
0 of 6 shooting. He just has enough games where he does nothing that I'm worried about his true higher end as an NBA player. Not, oh, he didn't shoot well that night. He just has games where he doesn't contribute at all in any way, and that could be assists, that can be rebounds. I mean, his last 3 games of the season, he plays 100 minutes essentially, just under 100 minutes. He gets 2 rebounds in 2 of those games, 2 total rebounds.
Yep.
He has 8 total rebounds in 80 minutes. It's you're super athletic. You've got this perfect physique as an NBA player. You're a great athlete, and I just haven't seen like the breakthroughs, the accidental breakthroughs. And he had more his rookie season than he did this year, but it's just a little too inconsistent for me to fully buy in on Ochai. And I think the Jazz said, let's take a gamble and sell a year too early versus a year too late.
I was going to ask. I feel like with star players, role players, just basically everyone, when you're looking to potentially move on from them, it's sort of a balance of giving up too early or getting ahead of it and selling when they may have more value than they will in a year from now. Do you think that the Jazz sold on Ochai a little bit earlier, or do you think it was the right decision?
I think it was the right decision. Ultimately, you got an asset.
Yeah.
Again, you got a part of this first-round draft pick, and while including Kelly, you got your top 10 pick as well. So it makes sense. It's not like a home run. It's not a grand slam. Yeah. Like if you said, oh, you wanted to give Ochai 2 more years, and by year 4 he turns into an actual NBA player a la Aaron Nesmith in Indiana, I could see that happening with Ochai. The Jazz just aren't at a point where they need like low-level role players.
True.
They need to see if they have guys who can be real impact players to build around. And if you invest 3 seasons or 4 seasons in a guy who actually doesn't become somebody, that's a little bit harder to swallow, especially if you lose a draft asset in response. So it's not a great trade. It's not a perfect trade. I didn't think it was a perfect trade when they did it. I can absolutely understand why. And the gamble of getting a first-round pick for what you were getting at Ochai is fine. And if you say the Jazz hold on to the 29th pick and make it, the odds, what are the odds that player's better than Ochai? Like it's 50-50. It's fine. Very realistically, you get a player who's as impactful as Ochai with that 29th pick. Like I don't think that's out of the realm of possibilities at all because Ochai has not yet performed like a lottery pick. He's performed like a late first-round pick who's 24 years old, who's just kind of coming in to contribute a little bit.
All right, you want to get into the mailbag?
Yeah, let's take another quick break really quick.
Okay.
We will come back. I know that was a bit of a long segment. We'll take a quick break. We will come back, answer your mailbag questions. Stick around. More Jazz Notes coming up next. Welcome back to the Jazz Notes podcast. Appreciate everyone listening every week. Let's get to our favorite segment every week of the podcast. That is the mailbag. You send in your questions to my Twitter prompt, and we address them on the episode and actually in an article. Subscribe to the Jazz Notes newsletter as well. It's your early access to the Q&A, which usually doesn't come out until a day or two later. So subscribe to the newscast you can find, or the newsletter. You can find that at kslsports.com. And I generally put a link into basically every article I write, so you can find it there.
And also should be a link to subscribe to the newsletter in every description of these episodes.
Yeah.
First up, question from Sam. Is there any more news on the rebrand new jerseys?
I had told you I think there was a chance it would get done before the end of the month, and that is not. I've heard that's not the case.
Okay.
Well, I haven't heard that's not the case, but that's not the case.
Yep.
That sounds confusing. It's not like anyone told me it wasn't happening. I'm just reading the tea leaves of what I've seen is going on, and actually what I thought might be something is not something. So I don't expect it in the next week or two, but I could still see it happening before the draft.
Okay. Next up from
Sorry,
Jake
that's
the
not
Lynx.
more substantive,
Yeah.
but it's something.
Next up from Jake the Lynx. Series of questions here about the Timberwolves. If the Wolves are going to win a championship, this seems like the best year for Jazz fans for it to happen. What are the chances the future Minnesota picks and swaps could still end up in the lottery? And how would them winning a championship this year affect those chances?
I actually agree with Jake. If let's say it's inevitable the Timberwolves are going to win a title, this is the best year to do it.
Yep.
I mean, next year would be bad because you own their pick. Like, you want them to be bad next year. They're not going to be bad next year.
No.
They're going to be really good barring a Minnesota Timberwolves-like run of injuries, or a Memphis Grizzlies-like run of injuries where they just lost Ja and Triple J and Steven Adams. Like, everybody got hurt.
Everyone.
Marcus Smart broke his hand. Like, barring that, Minnesota's going to be good next year. So, yeah, win the title. I mean, honestly, them winning the title doesn't have any impact on anything the Jazz do this year.
Nope.
At all. But I'll give you the line of thinking of why it actually is good. They win this year. Everyone's happy. You got what you came for. Now you go do the Bruce Brown thing and you just sign your big deal elsewhere. Like, I got my ring. I won, and now I'm going to go cash in on winning. And my agent says, hey, man, cool. You like all your teammates in Minnesota. You're also going to like your teammates in Houston. And they've got a bunch of money to spend next offseason or whenever. You know, I'm just throwing out a hypothetical. You have your championship ring, and you know what sounds really good with a championship ring? $100 million contract. And Minnesota can't pay you, Naz Reid, next summer. And Rudy, your legacy is done, man. Like, you won the title. You got your ring. There's no, like, let's run it back and try and do it again, and, like, I'll take a hometown discount because we're so close, and I don't know if my next opportunity presents a chance to win a title, and that's what I have to do before the end of my career. No, win a title, and then everyone can go their separate ways. And that happens all the time.
Yes.
I mean, it happened with Bruce Brown last year. It happened with Jeff Green last year. Jeff Green bailed on Denver to make $5 million a year, where Denver would have given him $2 million. Like, that $2 million mattered to him.
Yep.
So win a title, and Kyle Anderson says, like, yeah, I'm going to go get $12 million. I'm not going to settle for $6 million. But if they're close, and let's say they come up short in a Game 7 in Boston, maybe they run it back, and then maybe they run it back 2 years from now. That's, I guess, the worst-case scenario. Now, I actually don't think that's all that realistic in general, because I don't think the Timberwolves are going to be able to pay everyone and have this $300 million salary cap, plus all the luxury taxes and then the penalties you get from being in the second apron. But, I mean, almost better win now, everyone's happy, and you don't need to keep it together. I mean, again, Denver won a title. They lost those guys, and now they're going to lose more guys this offseason, or going to have to trade them just to keep their books safe. And you know what owners like? Well, I got my title. The owner gets their title and isn't going to say, well, why am I spending $400 million to rerun a team that won a title? Like, most owners aren't Lacob or Lacob in Golden State, who are just going to keep it together hell or high water. A lot of guys say, no, I got my ring. That's what I wanted. Living high off the hog for the next decade off of that, and then I'm going to go a little bit lower salary, and I don't need to pay everybody. It was fun while it lasted, and good for us. That's all that we needed. I made my money off the title team. I'm not going to lose it now on the back end, keeping a title team together for no reason that isn't actually going to win a title. So, yeah, Jake, I think there's real value to the Timberwolves winning this year and everyone going their separate ways in the next season or two.
The only unfortunate thing, looking ahead to however far those picks go out, as long as Anthony Edwards is in town, and like you said, barring some crazy injury, they're going to be at least a playoff team.
Yeah, at least a playoff team. I mean, he's going to be a top 5 or 6 player in the NBA, and, you know, that fluctuates between the best team in the NBA and the 6th seed, 7th seed, which you can kind of look at how the Dallas Mavericks have operated under Luka. As long as Luka's been there, they've kind of been up, they've kind of been down. They've never been the best team. They've never been the worst team. They tanked last year to get the 10th overall pick, which, of course, they wouldn't do for the Jazz. So, yeah, maybe those Minnesota picks, as long as they have Anthony Edwards, aren't enormously valuable. The question, the Jazz own a pick in 2030 from Minnesota.
True.
Do we think Anthony Edwards is going to be there? I don't know what the world's going to look like in 2030. So the odds that, like, he's going to be on the roster at that point are probably pretty slim, because nobody's on the same roster 6 years from now in the NBA. And again, that's some of the back end of those picks. And also, you have those picks not just to make them, but also to trade them.
Yes.
And the Jazz will trade a lot of these picks.
Next up from Jimmy Robinson, if the Jazz put a package together for a superstar, who will be the young, unproven player that the team insists to be in the deal and the Jazz don't want to include in the deal? I would guess the order is Hendricks, George, Kessler, Sensabaugh.
And that's not your guess, that's Jimmy's guess.
Yep.
When you say I would guess the order, that's what he put in there. I will tell you that there was some talk about DeJounte Murray to the Jazz at the trade deadline, and it was going to cost the Jazz Keontae George, and the Jazz said no.
Okay.
So there's already one name that was in there at the trade deadline of the team wanting Keontae George, and the Jazz said, I think we like Keontae George a little bit. So that was already one player they've done it for. It would take a special type of player to get, Taylor Hendricks, I think. I mean, you're talking about a big-time piece. The Jazz aren't going to add a non-all-star and just sprinkle in their number 9 overall pick, who's really toolsy and actually pretty intriguing. I liked a lot of what I saw from Taylor Hendricks last year. So it would take a special type of guy to fit in here. But that trade certainly exists, and I'm not sure any of these guys are truly untouchable. But, yeah, if it's like the extra piece, let's throw out Jaden McDaniels as an example. When the Jazz were trading Rudy Gobert, they wanted Jaden McDaniels, and they said, no, we're not going to throw in Jaden. And the Jazz were like, yeah, that's who you got to have. And finally they added like another first-round pick or a pick swap or whatever, and that kind of pushed the Jazz over the edge. Yeah, maybe you get there in a trade where the Jazz are putting all these major pieces together to try and get a star, and you're quabbling over the last piece of the trade. Is it Taylor Hendricks or is it a draft swap? I could see that. I don't think the Jazz would hesitate to trade either Kessler or Sensabaugh.
I was about to say.
That doesn't mean they're on the trade market.
Yes.
Actually, I mean, the way Danny Ainge, you can kind of read what Danny Ainge actually feels when he talks. He kind of seems like he likes Bryce Sensabaugh. I think he kind of likes Bryce.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean he doesn't like Walker at all. I'm not saying that. I think Bryce is a better shooter than his numbers showed, and I agree with that. So I think there's something there where he's kind of in on Bryce a little bit. And the Jazz want to give him a chance. The Jazz want to see if these guys can pan out.
Next question.
Did that answer the question? Sometimes I want to make sure I actually addressed what you asked. But I will tell you, I mean, that's already happened.
Yes.
The Jazz aren't actively trying to get rid of these guys.
Next up from Utah Jazz News, why do people think we aren't extending Lowry?
the Jazz are either going to trade Lowry or they're going to extend him.
Yes.
As long as Lowry will sign. If Lowry doesn't sign, that also doesn't mean the Jazz have to trade him. I think the Jazz are going to give him money. He can make a little bit more money if he waits to sign next offseason, and maybe he will. I still get the impression he's going to sign. I get the impression that the extension's going to get done, and that's the top priority for the Jazz. But the Jazz aren't going to say no to a Lowry extension. That's not how it would work at all. Either the Jazz will trade him, and that's why he's not signing an extension, but wherever he gets traded to, he will sign that if he can. Again, some of those CBA rules of like, well, now you got to wait because your bird rights aren't there, and it's only your early bird rights or whatever. But if he's here and the Jazz can sign him, they will sign him. But if they traded him, well, obviously the extension doesn't matter at that point. So I don't get I've never heard anything other than the full plan is to have him here long term.
Next question from Alex. Would you trade Lowry for Michael Porter Jr. and multiple first-round picks? I think I would do this trade as the Jazz. I don't know if I would do it as the Nuggets.
Okay.
I think that people are quick to be like, oh, especially think about it. When Denver went down 2-0, lost both the home games to Minnesota, people were like, oh, okay, we thought this was a guaranteed back-to-back championship. Now what does the future look like for them? And then they win the 3 games in a row. It's like, okay, they're back. They're going to be champions again. And I think we're back into the recency bias mode where they lost. It's like, okay, they need to do something. I just think that, like you wrote about in your recent article, it'll probably be in the mailbag. You guys should definitely look at Ben's parody article. Anything can happen. There's so many teams that are contenders. Yeah. So I think that Michael Porter Jr. would fit better with what Denver's trying to do than Lowry would. Okay. And also, I don't even really like it for the Jazz that much either because picks are picks, but I feel like this would be a lot like a Timberwolves trade instead of a Cavs trade to where those picks, they have Jokic in town. I don't think he's going anywhere. Probably will never be very good.
Lowry is better at everything than Michael Porter Jr. Let's get that straight.
Yes.
He's better at everything than Michael Porter Jr. Michael Porter Jr. averaged 16.7 points per game. Lowry averaged 26.
Yep.
Right? I don't know exactly what Lowry was at. Wasn't it 26 last year? Lowry is a significantly better pure scorer. He was at 23 points per game this year. 25 last year. So he's anywhere between 7 to 10 points better per game than Michael Porter Jr. And he's doing it as the number one guy, meaning he's also the top of the scouting report.
Yes.
Something Michael Porter Jr. has never done. He's been healthier throughout his career than Michael Porter Jr. has. He shoots better than Michael Porter Jr., which I know is crazy, but his effective field goal percentage, even last year, 57%. Michael Porter Jr.'s was at 58%, so it's a little bit better. But again, Lowry is taking much more difficult shots. He's not getting set up by Nikola Jokic. You put Lowry there as a rich man's Michael Porter Jr., my head would explode. It's awesome how good Lowry would be there. So no, I wouldn't do this trade if I were the Jazz at all. And I just don't think the picks you're going to get are going to be valuable.
Yeah.
You're just not going to get good enough picks as long as Lowry and Jokic are together and Jamal Murray. Yeah, you're going to talk about the worst picks in the league. I mean, they still, I think they have the Jazz lost a coin toss this year with Denver for that 29th, 28th pick because it was actually owed to them from Oklahoma City. And they finished with nearly identical records. That's why there was a coin toss. So, no, I wouldn't do that trade.
The one thing that I would be worried about is I think that Lowry is kind of a timid player. Like we were talking about times in the season where he needs to go get the ball, right? And I would just be worried about him maybe potentially falling back into kind of how he was with the Cavs.
Oh, it's exactly who he would turn into.
Yes.
He would go back to being the third best player and not average 23 points a game. But if you bring Michael Porter Jr. to Utah, he doesn't jump up to being Lowry Markkanen.
No, yes, exactly.
So I think there's a big difference there. And then the draft capital that Denver can offer just would not get close to closing that gap. Again, if I was trading Lowry Markkanen, it's I really do want to wait until Oklahoma City feels the pinch and is like, Jalen Williams isn't good enough. He just might not be good enough, so we're going to trade him. And it's no, he is good enough. He's playing third tier behind Chet and Shea. If that ends up being the order, Shea's going to be number one, and then whatever, Chet or Jalen Williams number two. That's the trade I'm waiting for. Or Jalen Green, Alperen Şengün, a bunch of picks or something, or one of those guys and a bunch of picks. I'm not doing it for Michael Porter Jr.
One question, then we can move on. Would it sweeten the pot, make it any more worth it for you if maybe they throw in a young player, Peyton Watson, Christian Brown, anything like that?
They don't have any good young players.
Yeah, fair.
Hence, those guys not playing in the postseason at all. I love the idea of Peyton Watson. Maybe he turns into a good player.
Yeah.
He was intriguing during the regular season. It's weird how everybody playing next to Nikola Jokic makes them look really good.
Yes.
Wow. Amazing. I'm stunned that the best passer I've ever seen in my life is 7 feet tall and makes everyone's life really easy. And Jamal Murray, who's never made an all-star team, and we're like, how has he never made an all-star team? It's because he's actually not as good as he looks, but he looks great playing next to Nikola Jokic. And that's not to say Jamal's not a very good player, but Jamal could be replaced with 10 other shooting guards in the NBA, and Denver would not change at all. It could be Booker. It could be Donovan Mitchell. It could be even some lesser players than Devin Booker, and they would still be extremely, extremely high-level players, or an extremely high-level team, because Jokic is that good. And I like Jamal. He's just not as good as the playoff numbers lead you to believe.
Next up from Tingus Pingus, do you know any players the Jazz have interest in this offseason in either trades, free agency, or the draft?
I haven't heard specifically on anybody, to be honest with you. And look, the Jazz aren't telling you, and they're not going to tell anyone. And why? You're going to cost yourself money by saying, I think Isaiah Hartenstein was a perfect fit for the Jazz, and his agency says, oh, cool. We think he's a great fit, too, at $30 million a year. So, no, I haven't heard that at all. I know Danny Ainge said he liked Zach Edey. I actually could see we talked a little bit about, the 3 draft picks. Like, maybe you can package 29 and 32. Does it get you up to 24, 23, and Zach Edey's still sitting on the board? He slipped a little bit on draft night. I could see that. Yeah. Absolutely. I would take a flyer on Zach Edey. I think he's actually kind of intriguing. I could see something like that. But no, I haven't heard specifically who the Jazz like, though Danny Ainge said specifically he likes Zach Edey. That wasn't exactly inside information for anybody. We've thrown out names. I mentioned Hartenstein. I mentioned Kyle Anderson. Another name I would keep an eye on who's going to look to cash in because he was a minimum signing this year is Derrick Jones Jr.
Yes.
In Dallas. He draws their toughest defensive assignment. He's actually started to knock down threes finally. Now, that might be because he's playing next to Kyrie and Luka. And again, like everyone playing next to Jokic, you look a lot better when you're on loaded rosters. But Derrick Jones Jr., as much as he might like starting and having the best shooting year of his career, he probably likes money more than that.
Yep.
And he doesn't make any in Dallas, and they don't have money to pay him next year, and the Jazz have a lot of money to spend. Now, he could end up in Philly again. He could end up in these different teams. But the Jazz are going to have money to spend. Why not go and get a 26-year-old player who fits your roster and actually would fit really nicely next to Lauri Markkanen, providing you some athleticism and some defense, who's shooting 34% from 3. Again, he's not an elite shooter, but it's better than he's ever shot the ball before. So that's the type of name I'd look at that we probably haven't talked enough about. Derrick Jones Jr. is a big one I would circle as far as experience, role, age. He kind of checks all the Jazz's boxes.
Speaking of those draft picks, next up from Jazz Time Jones, how much value do the late picks have that the Jazz own, combine and move them to where, or do they trade them for future assets? I don't see them making 3 picks again. He says, thanks, this is my favorite pod with the mailbag. Thank you, Jazz Time Jones, for always sending in your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Appreciate you listening. They have value. They have a ton of value. In fact, we don't know exactly the value yet because of, as you mentioned, having the second round on a second night where all these people have this 24-hour window or 18-hour window to sell themselves on. I can't believe Tyler Kolek fell out of the first round. I got to have that point guard. Probably has more value than it did in the past where guys are scrambling.
Yes.
I absolutely believe that. There's going to be less scrambling, and because there's less scrambling, there's going to be more teams. You just can't make 30 phone calls in 4 minutes.
Yep.
The truth is, you can try and get ahead of it, but the draft changes really quickly, but now you have 18 hours to make some of those calls. So that is really valuable for the Jazz, and I think that helps. And again, look at, the names you brought up, Peyton Watson, Christian Brown. Those guys are late first, early second round picks. Well, that's where championship teams can get better.
Yes.
So Boston doesn't win the title this year, or Dallas doesn't win the title this year, or, let's throw Minnesota in this mix. Doesn't win a title this year. They got to get better, but they don't have free agency money, but they can afford $2 million for the draft pick. So they trade for the draft pick. And maybe it is a guy or a future first that they want to give up, which still has value for the Jazz. Not that Minnesota has any future first they can send to the Jazz. They already own them all. But, these teams where the Jazz could get another asset down the line, and maybe even potentially way down the line, which is smart. I know everyone wants their picks. The Jazz don't need 3 more rookies. But maybe, yes, Denver says Tyler Kolek, I'm just throwing a name out there, who's projected at the end of the first, or Bub Carrington or whatever. We think he's the guy. Jazz are like, well, we're not going to develop another 20-year-old. We don't have any interest in that. But you want to give us your 2030 pick that's protected. You're not going to get an unprotected pick for the 29th pick in this year's draft, but lottery protected. And in 2030, that turns into the 17th pick. Well, that's a huge upgrade over the 29th pick this year.
Yes.
That's where there's value. Absolutely. But I could see the Jazz saying, hey, we need older players, and let's draft a 29th pick overall. Of a 4-year player who can step in and play right away, knows how to play, and has still a little bit of a swing because they're rookies. I could see that happening.
And also, I think that there's going to be some teams who don't get the guy that they have been eyeing in the draft, and then they're like, okay, let me trade up to the top of the second day, right?
Yeah.
Trade up to the top of the second round, and maybe we can get something that we'll feel good about. Last question here from Jeff Martinez. When negotiating Lowry's contract this offseason, couldn't the Jazz just front-load it, making him cheaper in the future when they want to be good, making it easier to add and pay better players to pair with him?
Yes, I've been told specifically from people who are in charge of this stuff, without naming any specific names, but there are a lot of ways for the Jazz to structure this deal.
Yep. And honestly, I think that would be smart, right? Pay him a lot right now because the Jazz are probably still not going to be competing for a lot next year. We talked about how the West is going to be the West again. But then going into years 2 through 4, you can be a little bit more competitive and you don't have to be paying your best player as much.
Or you see a couple of guys in free agency that you really like and you pay them, and all of a sudden you don't have all this extra money left over and you have it a smaller number up front and you backload it. There are a lot of options. It should reflect what you do this summer. If you don't do anything, do what you did with Jordan Clarkson. Remember, the Jazz didn't sign anybody last year, and they said, well, Jordan, we want you here. We can give you $60 or $50 million, but the first year's going to be half of it. You're going to get 25, and now Jordan goes from making 25 this year, which is a lot, down to 15 next year. That's a good deal for the Jazz. Like, Jordan Clarkson's worth $15 million a year. Is he worth 25? Probably not. But over the life of the contract, he's worth the 50.
Yes.
So there are just different ways to structure it to fill what cap space you have and didn't use that could be beneficial, either by being cheap up front or really expensive up front. I'm with you. I generally tend to think you go really expensive up front because you like deals that get smaller, especially when the salary cap inevitably goes up. But there's a lot of different ways the Jazz can work out this contract. It's not just, black and white. These are what the numbers have to be because it's your rookie max extension, your first max extension, that all has to look the same. There's actually a lot of different ways the Jazz can play with it, and they know that and are actually excited about how they can structure it to benefit both Lowry and the team.
Thank you guys for tuning into the Jazz Notes podcast. Over the next couple weeks, we're going to wrap up our player highlights and then start getting into some NBA draft previews.
Yeah, we'll do a lot of NBA draft. We are a little more than a month away, so don't worry. We will get into that. We are not neglecting that. That is where everyone's interest is going to be. If you've missed it, go to KSLSports.com. I think I've already got 6 breakdowns of players that are going to be in the conversation at 10, and I will continue to get those out. I mean, I think I've done as many as 30 in years past, so we will probably have a good number again this year. If that's what you're looking for, we've got it already at KSLSports.com, and they will start bleeding into this podcast going forward. Tune in again next week, and subscribe. Read us at KSLSports.com. Thanks for listening to the Jazz Notes podcast.